Record, hit the button. All right, we are live. So, welcome to today's class. In a series of very many classes that we've had. We are now in the fun, exciting, and very treacherous world of Django that you all have been experimenting with over the past couple of days. And let's see. So today on our agenda, I have three things that I'd like to do. The first one, as requested, was going over yesterday's Django queries and ORM challenge, which was difficult, but a necessary thing to get through nevertheless. Then today we're going to talk a little bit about validators and maybe if we can get to it, a little bit about Django forms, just as a quick introduction. And then we'll turn you guys loose on tonight's problem set. That's basically it for today. Does anybody have questions, comments, concerns, anything like that? Also, does anybody have questions, comments, concerns about the assessment?
Yeah, that was one of the things we wanted to try to see. I know it's Christmas, so it's probably going to take a few days for the results to come in, but of course, we'd like to know how we did. Yeah.
All right. Yeah, I don't have any information on that at this time because I don't believe we've started grading just yet. But I'll probably get started on it tomorrow or Friday. I'm not sure when the other instructors will. And depending on how that goes, I suspect if the other instructors are on a similar schedule as me, you might end up getting the grades by Christmas. Otherwise, probably after Christmas / before New Year's is what I would expect. But it may be staggered out again, depending on how we decide to divvy it up. So hopefully, I know that wasn't the perfect answer, but rest assured your grades will come eventually, hopefully. But also, how do you guys feel like the assessment was, and how do you feel like you did on it overall, if you want to talk about that?
I don't think it was too terribly bad because a lot of the stuff that we saw was it kind of mimicked some of the challenges that we had.
That's good.
So just personal experience, I didn't think it was too terribly bad. Now, if you told me to do an assessment over CSF, that'd be a different story. But
Indeed, indeed. Well, I'm glad to hear that it wasn't too bad for you, Matthew. Anybody else have similar or wildly different reactions to the assessment?
I think like just compared to some of the queries we were doing by the end of that little chunk there, the assessment was much easier than what we had been doing up to that point.
Yeah, so the intention is for the homeworks to be a little bit more challenging, to be honest, because the homeworks are things that like we want you to solve with other people, things that we want you to do so that way you can better understand the material. And then the assessments are like, okay, let's back the pressure off a little bit. Let's give you guys something just to make sure that you get the basics of it. Or, well, a little bit more than the basics, as I'm sure you all have realized through these assessments. They're not piecemeal. But it's basically just like, all right, we know that we know that you know how to do this. Let's just double check that and have like a benchmark that we can say, yeah, you got this. Let's move on, if that makes sense. But yeah, it generally they are supposed to be easier than the homework problems. But of course, the homework problems, as always, range from being easy to why on earth is this a homework problem, as you all know very well. Any other last comments, questions, concerns, things about the assessment before we move on to yesterday's homework problem? Okay, if not, we'll move on to Django queries then. So I did notice some pull requests on this, which is great. So before I launch into my spiels, would anybody who did submit a pull request for this or would anybody who had specific questions about it like to either share how they solved it? Again, volunteers are more than welcome, or share what questions or dilemmas you had when solving it.
I mean, I just used the resource given to us, that queries cheat sheet, and I realized that it was broken up into the different, like, this is going to return to you a single object. This is going to return to you multiple objects in a list. And then this part is what you would do in your where part of your query. So once I figured that out, kind of knew where to look for all the information, just followed
Okay.
what went down.
Nice. So thank you for volunteering that, Tiffany. And yeah, basically, whenever you see something weird and confusing in documentation, breaking it down into those parts of like, okay, this one returns X base, this one only returns one thing and it takes in one thing, or this one takes in a bajillion things and also returns a bajillion things. Like breaking it down that way is super helpful. And I'm really glad that you were able to do that. Would you actually like to share your solution with the class and maybe talk to us a little bit about some, you don't have to go through all, but you're more than welcome to, of the methods that you used as well?
Sure. Let me pull it up here.
Go for it. Yeah, you should be able to screen share.
Okay. It was, I'll admit, when I first looked at it, I was like, oh my gosh, this is a lot. Where do I even start? Okay, let me get it up here. Screen share. Okay. So here we are. Basically, when I got in the file, and I have an M1, but I didn't do that install that was recommended because I wanted to see first if I would run into issues. I didn't want to install extra things I didn't need to. So I never did install that, and it worked just fine. But the first thing he asked us to do was to run that. Let me get back to I like the README on the other screen here. Yes, to run the Python, like the test file here. And to basically, and I chose to do it the way that you can do one test at a time instead of having all of them go. Oh gosh, of course I need to change into, where is it now?
I believe it's the ORM queries, because you're in Django queries first.
Oh, but I need to run the test.py, so that's under products, right?
Oh, let's see. So this is also why like I find minimizing all the folders at the beginning to be really helpful. Because, okay, well, yeah.
Yeah.
So if we start from there, so we need to first go into the ORM queries directory because that's where
Okay.
the thingy is with the test. So
What about the virtual machine? You gotta go into the virtual machine as well.
oh, that too.
Oh yeah. Do I have to go into that to run this, or?
So let's talk about that for a second, because I know at least when I was learning how to program in Django, the virtual environment stuff was extremely confusing. So normally when we run things in Python, we don't always have to enter the virtual machine. Like if we're just running like a simple Python script, we can just run our import statements and in our giant Python file and hit run. But we have a problem here. And the problem here is that in our virtual environment, we import things like Django and pandas and all of this other stuff that isn't necessarily available in default Python. So if you don't enter the virtual environment and run it, and you run your, say, manage.py file, it'll be like, what is Django? How do I access the things you are telling me to from Django? I have no clue what's going on. So that's why we always pip install Django in our virtual environment. And the same thing for a lot of the SQL commands that are used too. Those are also, again, part of your virtual environment. If you don't enter the virtual environment, then Python will just go like, I have no clue where this is coming from. So that's why we always want to enter the virtual environment first before running stuff.
Okay, so I actually don't know how to enter the environment since I've just followed the setting it up and activating it. Do I have to activate it again?
Yep. So you'll have to activate that. And to do that, you'll have to go out of your current directory, most likely, and go back. So now you're in the Django queries, which is this guy, which is exactly where your virtual environment folder is. So from there, you should be able to activate it. Okay.
Okay, and that's still that source. Oop. What is it? Source venv. Activate. Okay.
There we go. So something else that I like to do, though you guys might not have to, is every time I do a change directory command, yeah, I always type an ls or dir just so that I know what's there, because folder trees are lovely and helpful, but at the same time, it can get kind of confusing.
This is where I can run my tests. 1, 3, or it has to run manage, I guess, not the test. I can't see with these videos on the side. Here we go.
Also, you can when you're changing you can also combine the cd and ls into one command, which can be kind of helpful too. So if you were to do that in the future, you could type cd products and then a double ampersand and then ls. Here, I'll pop it in the chat real quick so we can say products and
Also,
like that.
Let's see, I'm just going to comment this out so I show what I did for when a test failed, because it's going to show all them passing, so that doesn't really help. Oh crap, what did I do here? No such file or directory.
So for this one, I think it's because you're inside of products.
Okay.
And the manage.yeah. So you'll want to go one back. Yep. Now that should work.
Much better at explaining what I did in this part.
Also, instead of rewriting the whole thing every time, you can use the up and down arrows while you're like in the console to access commands that you ran before and after.
Oh, I only know the Control P for the last ones. That changes a lot of things. Thank you.
This is like when you're like running and then running and exiting like 20 times when you're testing something, it is the most helpful thing in the world to, instead of rewriting the whole test command out, just like hit the up arrow and hit enter again. It works like a charm.
I did the wrong thing here. These are the tests, of course, that's gonna pass. I need to take that out. This is just showing how I even got to this point in the first place. So when it runs the test, I did the reading where it failed, and I clicked to find that file and I saw, okay, so it's running these tests. And then I found test 1 and I saw, okay, so it's failing on line 15, saying that there's none type. So probably because it didn't have anything in this. Well, I didn't know what it was failing. I just saw something had a none type. So then I just started clicking around on the methods here to see which one. And so of course, when I clicked this one, I saw this whole file was empty. And I'm like, oh, that explains it. That's probably where I got start. So then once I found this file, I kind of realized, okay, this is what all these tests are referring to, because they're all in product CRUD, which makes sense because here's a class product CRUD. So all the tests are creating an instance of that and then running the method within the class with whatever input they put in. So that's how I found where to start with. As far as, oh, I guess this won't let me share the file. I just shared. I'll have to stop sharing and reshare. But I realized that the test wanted us to return all products. So I'm like, okay, this is going to be a query. And I'm going to stop share and redo the share for the right screen. No, wrong desktop here. Okay, so then I went to this cheat sheet because this is queries. I mean, this what I assumed was queries. And I honestly didn't know where to start at first, but I started in class here. It had this students.objects.all, which gave me the getting everybody from there. And then I saw that was here and read a little bit about that. But then from there, I kind of just went through all of these different all the different methods, and I realized that this filter would, I also Googled a little bit too, because this is kind of very basic, I guess. It didn't really tell me what it was going to, what it looked like. At least for me, I saw it took in arguments, a lot of different keyword arguments, but I didn't know much else about that. So I just Googled it and saw how it's structured. But I noticed that you can also like chain them like they say here, so you could filter. And once I learned what filter was, which was kind of the, let's see, my product crud, I used it a lot here to kind of, that's your like where your rating or where your field equals the input or the value that's input in the method. So that's kind of the start of a where, like the filter would return only something where, and then you specify what that where is. And I don't know how else to explain. I just kept going back to here and finding things that seemed, like I said, this one I realized it returns query sets. So then I found that this return like can return multiple items. But then when you use these ones like get and count, it returns like one thing. So I couldn't use that to do the ones that wanted lists of IDs for certain things. So I didn't even look at that when they wanted a list, unless if it was like a count that you could add on. And then these ones were all of the where statements. So like I use greater than a lot. I use contains a lot. That's kind of like the like, I guess, keyword in SQL. And yep, just read a lot of documentation. But once I was figured out how to set it up, it kind of made a little bit more sense. Like it seems like you always start with that filter and then you can add stuff afterwards. Now I saw people using the queue, I forget what it's called technically, that little queue function or whatever, to do the and or queries, but mine were working just fine without it. I think because I did the whole I guess statement again. I started product.objects.filter, whereas theirs were just product.objects.filter. And then they did the first statement, then the or, and then the second little rating greater than. So I think that's why theirs worked with the queue and mine works without. Not sure. But yeah, everything starts with filter, and then I just tacked on other little, except for excluding. That's the one that is everything but this category. Makes sense because that's what it sounds like. The aggregate functions, that one took me a minute because I found max, but I didn't realize you had to put this aggregate in front of it. So that one actually was a Google product, but again, these are all in, and it's in here too. I found it up. Where is it? It was in the, here. So it's all in the documentation. Some of them do have a example.
Yep. And for reference, this is basically the exact same way that we are going to be solving every single challenge for the remainder of the course. So go to the documentation, figure out why the tests are going wrong. Go to the documentation, figure out how to solve it, plug it in, finagle it until it works, and then repeat for every single test case. And looking things up like you did is the perfect way to solve it. So really nice work, Tiffany. Thank you for sharing.
Thank you.
Does anybody have questions about why some of the methods that Tiffany or that you guys used worked or did not work for the problems yesterday?
Yes, I have a question.
Go
I'm
ahead,
sorry.
Yusuf.
What's the context of using like flat equals true? Is that what you had, Tiffany? Something like that. Was that like was that the one that needed a list?
That was the one that if you used that method, it returned like tuples. And if you wanted to have just a single thing, you needed to put that. If you only wanted to pass in one parameter, I guess you needed to put that flat equals true. I
Oh,
don't know why, it just told me to.
okay. Thank you.
Yeah, that was a lifesaver. I was stuck on that one for like 15, 20 minutes until I saw right in the documentation it said to put in flat equals true. And I was like, oh, okay. Worked right away. So yeah, that was super helpful.
Because isn't
Yeah,
it values
Django's-
list, like values list will return always a list with tuples in it, and even if there's a single element, it will still add the comma to make it a tuple.
Right.
So that's why you need flat equal true to eliminate that comma that becomes like a single item in the list. If I'm correct, that's how I understood it.
Yep, no, that is correct, Bazooka. Right, yeah. Django's stuff when you're putting equal signs does get very confusing, much like SQL, but Django decides to add in another layer of complexity. So yeah, basically regular equal sign only gives you tuples, flat equals, I guess you could say it flattens the tuple, and just returns regular things, which is far better. So any other questions before we move on to a wee bit of validators and validations?
Yeah, so my question is when you use the command fail fast, it gives you one error of a time, which is awesome. It helps declutter everything, especially yesterday you had 19 tests to figure out, but a lot of times when I was having trouble with one of them, because they come in order, I wanted to skip ahead and then maybe come back to that one. But you understand what I'm trying to ask here? Is there a way to
Yeah.
pick and choose which tests to go through instead of not using fail fast and seeing everything?
So fail fast is the one that people would use most of the time to go test by test. But in a case like yours where you want to like jump around a little bit, honestly, I would just go commenting. So like if you know that part of your code, like that the tests work, or like you just don't want to go over that test, just comment the whole test out and then run your code without the fail fast, and then that'll only run the uncommented tests. So that'll help declutter things and help you focus a little bit more. It's a little bit impromptu, but that's something that I've found can work on occasion.
Okay, thank you.
Does anyone else have any solutions that might help Chris out? Or has anyone experienced similar dilemmas before?
I was just saying, I just did the same thing. There was a couple of times I commented things out, but
Yeah, as far as I'm aware, Django doesn't have a method that lets you skip to like a certain failure. And I suppose like there's a reason behind that too. Like, if you're a programmer running through code for the first time, say, you don't know what all the tests are, and B, you wouldn't really have a good reason to skip from test to test. So saying skip to test number 17 is something that, for like a developer who's running through tests on their own, they'd be like, why would you want to skip to test 17? Why not go from test 1, test 2, test 3, and so on? Which is my gut feeling for why they don't have something like that automatically implemented. But in general, if you want to skip to something or skip something, comment it out. Easiest approach I could think of. Any other questions, comments, concerns, things of that nature? All right. I'm gonna assume not. So let's go ahead and talk about validators. Pop open my empty VS Code. All right, so I've created a little VS Code thing that we can play around with for a bit, called Django demo, very simply. And today we're going to use that to experiment a little bit with validators. But in order to do that, the first thing that I need to do is create a model of something to validate. So does anybody have ideas for something we could create a model for? Okay, if not, let's say that we want to create a model for let's go with something really boring. Let's create a model for widgets. Or widget, I guess. So what's the first thing that I have to do when I'm creating a model class in Django?
You have to write models.model for the inheriting from the model class.
Okay. So all right, I've got my class made now. So all right, so I've got the class. It says that I'm inheriting from models.model, and I'm not getting squiggly lines there, which is great. And now we need to introduce some variables into this. So I'm assuming that I can just set this up like a regular Python class, right? So I can just say something like name equals that, and let's say like, I don't know, number, like ID number equals like 23. I can just write out my widget class like this, right? There's nothing different that I have to do at all in any way.
So there's a specific way you have to do in Django.
Yep. So yeah, unfortunately, Django is not nice. Django is not like normal Python in this sense. We can't just define our model classes like we would normally and write in, or define a init function and stuff. No, Django doesn't want us doing that. Instead, what we have to do is, and again, we can go back to the models.py from last time. And here, let me see. Can I share Django queries? There we go. All right. So hopefully you guys now see the Django queries window. And yeah, if we go back to it, we see that our Django model is broken up. So the first thing we have is our class, which is product. and that imports stuff from model.model. But then for each of the attributes, we could say for the class, like model, category, price, rating, etc. Each of those is a type of field that is derived from all the Django models. And there are a lot of options for fields. You've got character fields, text fields, integers, floats. I think Booleans are another one. Email. I think there might be a phone number field, but I don't remember. There is a date time field. And then there's also these two for time zone dot now, which give you, again, date time fields as well. So this is how we create a class in Django. We have to use their we don't have to use their predefined field. We can make our own, but it's a little bit more complicated. So it's best to use the predefined field types for what we're doing. So if we go back to the other models.py, the empty one, for example, for name of the widget, we would do models dot, and then it shows up right here that we want a character field, and then we need to set a couple of parameters. Okay, we can actually set a bunch of parameters, as shown here. These are literally all the parameters we can set. We can set, let's see, we can set the maximum length, we can set the database collation, we can set the uniqueness of this field entry, we can set if it's null or not, we can set whether it's serializable, for dates, database columns, a ton of stuff. But the thing that we're going to use for character fields, which is the one that's used most often, is the max length parameter, which basically says how long can this name be. So if you can only enter 10 characters in, for example, then the max length becomes 10. Otherwise, you could change the max like to 20, 30, whatnot. The next thing that we can do is we can set whether we want it to be default null or not. By default, this field is set to be false, but we can set it to true. So basically, when you create a new widget, what we're saying now is, I'm creating a new widget, creating a new row in this table. I'm going to create a widget with the name that can be up to 10 characters, and initially the name is blank. But we can also set the default value of the widget name. So I can set the default value to be Ouija. I don't know, or something else, which is again under our max length, right? And this is a non-null value. So, but for now, we'll just set this to null equals true. Then another thing we could do is we could say set the widget's ID number, and we could do again models dot integer field, and now again this is an integer, so there's no max length here, but we can set a default value for the integer too. We can set every widget to have an ID number of 100, and yeah, I guess we could do like something else as well. We could say something like I don't know. So let's say has been bought. And then we can do models dot Boolean field, and then we could say something like default equals false, or something to that extent. So this is the way that we're going to be creating our models in Django. And there's a very specific reason for why we create our models this way. So models in Django are great because, they can interact with your backend. They can, you can have some fun bringing those to and from SQL and storing your data, which is great. But the main purpose for us, for Django, is going to be bringing stuff from our Python and SQL backends to our HTML and CSS and JavaScript frontends. And the way we can do that is by using forms. And this is something that we'll probably cover in more detail. I'm going to say within the next 2 weeks. But Django also has a forms module that we can use. So if we go to my forms.py page, you can see here I've written from Django import forms. And we can follow the exact same setup as we did in our widget class to make a widget form. So I could say something like widget form, and then let's see, what are the other things I need to write down? Then it would be, instead of models.model, unfortunately, we need to type, let's see, forms.form. And then we basically do the exact same thing. I can copy over the name and ID number and has been bought, but instead of models this time, we change this over to form fields. So the reason that Django has that weird format that I mentioned earlier, where we can't just define a class with our, name equals 30 and using an init function and all that, is because Django's designed so that the models that you create in the backend can interface with Django's forms, which we can then, if you were to add in some HTML templates and some CSRF headers, those forms could then be brought up to the front end. So that's the reasoning behind this weird format. And also the reasoning behind why we're going to use validators in order to help clean our data. But before I move on, does how we set up a model make sense? Does anybody have questions about that for now?
Can I ask about the form?
Go for it, yeah.
Okay. I think I misunderstood how you explained it. Did you relate it to like a form as an HTML?
So you can insert the form as HTML. Yes. So it's a little bit weird, but basically what we're doing here is I'm creating a form like class/object that's still in Python. But what I could do is, and we'll get to this once we start interfacing the HTML with Django. But basically, you'll create a folder called templates. And inside that folder, you'll create a bunch of your HTML files. And inside your HTML file, you can basically say, hey, I have a form thing that I created in Django called widget form, or whatever your form is called. And I want to insert it into my HTML page. And then all of the fields that you created in your form class then become like HTML buttons and form fields that you can use.
Okay, thanks for explaining that again. That makes sense.
Yeah, it is a little bit confusing, honestly. But there will be examples of how this works again in like a week or so. But this is just the rationale behind A, why Django sets up its models in a slightly confusing way, and B, why validators are super important, which is what I'll get to next. But does anybody else have questions relating to forms or models or anything like that? All right, I'm going to assume not. So for now, let's close out of the forms.py. Honestly, we can just delete this because we don't need it anymore. All right, so now we have our models class. And so the reason that I bring up the forms is this. So let's say, you've got your form, your user's typing stuff onto your HTML page. They hit submit. The stuff that they type in goes from stuff they typed on their keyboard into the HTML. From the HTML, that stuff goes to your form. And from your form, Django in the backend will translate the stuff it entered into that form into stuff that goes back to your original model. So the one thing that we always like to assume when programming is that users can and will do stuff to try and break your code, whether intentionally or unintentionally. Like in the name field, for example, they might put exclamation marks or hashtags or a SQL injection for all we know. In the ID number field, sure, we've specified here that it should be an integer field, but what's going to stop them from typing in a bunch of dashes and letters? And in the same way for the has been bought, well, that one can probably just be a toggle button. But if we were to add in, for example, an email field, we could say like, I don't know, which email thing. We can say models.email field. We'll just say null equals false, or null equals true. Oops. What's going to stop them from entering into their email field? Hello, this is totally an email. Because what, that value, the email field at its core is just a character field. It's not anything special. So why can't they just enter that in there instead? So basically, to prevent users from entering in data that we don't want, this is where validators come in handy. And there's a few ways for us to be able to deal with validators. So the first one is by basically going here, and if I start typing validators, now this can basically add in a list of validators that we can use. And let me see if I can find the Django documentation, and I'll put it in the Slack. Actually, let me go ahead and change my share here to that. Validators, there we go. So, all right, this is about how to write validators. But if we go to validating objects, here we go. So, there's usually something in here. And okay, not really. But basically, if we go back here and we go to, let's say like the article, for example, you can have a function that cleans all of these articles. And it basically says, hey, if what we have is not okay, we're going to raise a validation error that has this written in it. And a validation error is a type of error that we can throw that says, hey, something's wrong here. Your data is bad. And that's basically all that validator functions do. It says, all right, hey, is what I have good? If what we have is good, okay. If not, throw a validation error. And Django has a ton of built-in validators. So, I mean, you've got these regex validators, you've got an email validator that specifically looks at like creating an email format. You've got a URL validator. Yeah, you've got a lot of validator options to choose from on there. So that's basically all that we're gonna do. So if I go back to, where is my models? There we go. So let's say for name, the first thing that I could do here is say validators is, let's see. Oh, and we also have to import it from core. I almost forgot that. There we go. So now it won't start glitching out. So one thing to keep in mind, inside of validators, the validators module are your validator functions. But inside of each of your fields, each of your fields in your models, there is a subfield called validators, or a property of them. And inside of this, you're going to create a list. And in that list, you're going to do validators dot, and basically whatever validators you want from that massive list of validators that I put earlier. So for example, we could use yeah, here, let's use, like, let's say I don't know, the prohibit null characters validator. That seems fun. If we go here, we say prohibit null characters validator. Where's like, there we go. And then in here, we have to provide an error message. So basically it says if this validator isn't thrown, we would, or if this validator is thrown, meaning, hey, this does have a null character, why do you have a null character? Fix it. Or something like that. Or in the same way, in the email field, we could say validators equals, and then here we could say validators dot email validator. And then in here we could say message equals, hey, this isn't an email. Why? Or something to that extent. And basically, when you run this, whatever your code is, and somebody enters a bad value into the form, or you take SQL data and you put it into Django through these models, and you get bad data, this will throw in a validation error or a value error with the given message that you put in. And that's basically all there is to validators. I mean, there are one or two other things that you can do where you can, for example, custom write a validator as well. So let's say, I don't know, what could be a good thing to validate? Here, let's say that we want to validate an ID. So we get def validate ID, and then we just say like ID value. And let's say we only want ID numbers. We want ID numbers less than 500 or something. So then how could we check if an ID value is less than 500? Oh, we just need to write a really simple if then statement. So if ID value is greater than or equal to 500, the next thing that we need to do, we also need to import the validation errors. So from Django.core.exceptions, import validation error. I think that's about it. Yep. So if the ID value is greater than 500, we can raise a validation error. And then the error can basically say whatever we want. We can say, hey, this is way too big, for example. And this is our custom validator function. So now I can put this into ID and say validator, oopsies, inside validators equals validate ID, for example. And yeah, that's basically the 101 for us for right now about what validators are and how we use them. Does anybody have comments, questions, concerns about what we just went over?
So Omar, the message, is that the one that will be displayed in the UI?
Yep, that's correct.
So look, I'm just kind of so sorry. I just couldn't see the whole picture. But why is it not added in the form?
How do you
Oh, kasi so from what I understand, the models is your database, right?
yes.
And then is the form the one that the user will, see in the UI?
Yeah, so I deleted the form for now because we're not really gonna use that again until next week or the week after. But basically, the models that I have here, like the widget class, this is all only in the backend. But the thing that I showed you guys earlier with that widget form, that is the thing that the users would see. So the validators that I'm putting in here and the validators that you guys are going to use in your homework today are all for validating stuff in the database in the backend.
So like the backend server will this is the response, like there's an error message.
Basically, yeah.
Okay, got it. Yeah, thank you.
But yeah, so in addition to that, you can use validators in the backend like we're doing here, and also validators in your forms for Django too. So if somebody's typing in something and then you don't want them to type that in, you can just tell them right away. By doing the exact same thing in the form, you can say something like form.email field null true, and then put the same thing with the validator in there. So that's why we're learning to do it for the back end, but we'll be doing it for the front end very shortly here too. Any other questions, comments, concerns?
When would you
Oh.
see these raised error messages?
Same place as always, in the console.
Oh,
So, yep. So much like for last time when you were running your Django tests and you saw a ton of errors every time because you hadn't fulfilled all the tests up there, that is also where you would see the errors for your validators too. Anybody else?
When you specify null equal to true there for the char field, that's because we wanna, like by default, it is not null.
Yes.
So, okay. So that's when you say null equal true, is that true for every single name?
So
Or is it your choice?
it's true for every single name in the sense that, let's say that you get a ton of data in your backend and you put that data into models, but some models, let's say, or some of the data that you get doesn't have the name field filled out. Or, yeah, it is the same vein, going back to the forms part. Let's say that a user is filling out a form on your website, but you need to decide whether or not you want them to be able to leave the name field blank or if you need them to fill it in. So if you want to leave it, yeah, or actually, no, I shouldn't say that. Here, let's go back to the first example. Correction. So yeah, you're getting data from the backend. Some fields have a name in them, some don't. What do we do with the things that don't by default come with a name? So by saying null equals true, we're saying, hey, the default value of name, if a name isn't provided, I'm going to set name to null. But if I took this out and I replaced this with something like default is John Doe, and it would say, all right, if I don't have a name put in, I'm going to replace it with John Doe. If you do have a name, great, you're good. But if you don't have a name, I replace you with John Doe. Similarly, for the null, if I don't have a name, you're good. If I do have a name, you're fine. If I don't have a name, I'm putting you in as null. So that's what the null equals true and the default bits do.
Great, thank you.
Anything else? All right. If not, Let's go ahead and talk about the homework for today before I turn you all loose. So today's homework assignment is Django validations. Also, I highly recommend looking at today's curriculum module because, again, it doesn't have just the validations, but it's also got your validators resource, which is basically the same thing that I sent you guys. It's got a database diagram, which we don't need for today, but QuickDB is fantastic. Query cheat sheet and Django docs. So again, these are things we're going to be reusing a ton. So please look at those before doing and while doing the assessment too. Or sorry, but homework challenge. Not assessment, not for a little while longer. Thank goodness. So today's challenge is Django validations. And we're going to be playing around with a bunch of swim records today. So basically what we're going to have to do is, again, as you can see, install the requirements. And if you run the test, you need to add some code to each attribute to pass the tests. And then also, there's another thing that we'll do using the swim record model, and you need to add in some validations using those tests. So if we look at, for example, say test.py, you see here that we have 8 tests that need to be validated for that one. And then for swim record, these are all the fields that we need to enter, much like last time. And inside each of the fields, again, don't forget to write in your nulls, true and false, or default values, and put in your validators using that validator format that we talked about earlier. Any questions before I set you guys loose in the groups? Okay, I'm gonna get those groups sent out in about 5 minutes here, so feel free to take a break for a few, get up, walk around. If you have any questions, comments, concerns at any point, let me know, and enjoy the rest of your evening. I will be here if you guys need help.